So, hi everyone. I'm Priscilla Nelson. I'm a professor at the Colorado School of Mines, who is in the mining engineering department. And I've been working for several years on a project that really deals with um, the the trust and the status of the mining industry with respect to the demands that are coming on producing new minerals, new metals that are needed for all purposes, critical minerals, energy transition, etc. And the importance of doing this in a responsible way and a different way. So as I was doing this project, started the conversations with Mónica, and we just started having brainstorms, big ideas coming out. And I think there was a bit of frustration on our parts, Mónica, where we kept hearing the same conversation over and over and over without any resolution and without any action. So you and I started having telephone conversations and started identifying the people whose voices we thought ought to be heard, with an idea more or less of creating a dinner party where we could invite people that we wanted to hear and we wanted to talk to each other to our dinner party and create a podcast that would tell a story that hadn't been told before. So it was in the fall of 2022, so getting on towards 2 years ago when we started this conversation. Is that how you remember things, Mónica?
Well, yes, precisely that. Your words bring me back extraordinary memories when we start talking, and much more kind of thinking on how we can make the industry more conscious about the responsibility it carries, and not only in terms of the business side, but at the same time in terms of legacy and in terms of the impact it has in the regions where it operates. And I remember actually that the fortune I had extraordinary opportunity to be a guest lecturer at the Colorado School of Mines, precisely about stakeholder engagement, and that opens us an opportunity to see our synergies. And I love, and I think I will stick to my mind, and I hope listeners keep that in mind. This is meeting friends around the dining table, because that's precisely what we envision. And when we really slowly discovered in this process that the answers are in history, and we learn from history how to do better, and there are plenty of opportunities to do good, and it's plenty of stories that haven't been told about the industry too, in all fairness. So yeah, I remember that with a little bit of nostalgia, but at the same time with great excitement as we have a stick to the plan and move forward on the idea.
Yeah, right. And as we started talking to other people, trying to find those voices that we wanted to invite to our dinner party, I think we ran into Lauren Barredo, who was with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and which is a wonderful network and has dealt with many of these topics on a global, international perspective. And she joined us in our conversations. But I think it wasn't very long, and early in the spring of 2023, that we found two people who, when we spoke with them, they had such a perspective that it was amazing. And they were Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson. And we found them separately and then found out that they knew each other. But the most amazing thing to me was they knew 50, 60 years of history of evolution that many people didn't know or had forgotten. And so our dinner party will probably happen in the future, where we invite those special voices that come from all the sectors of mining, But we focused pretty early in 2023 on Luke and Glenn with their fantastic backgrounds and stories from the 1950s and 60s right up to the present. And so we pivoted our concept, I think, at that point to this oral history. Let's try to tell the story from the point of view of these two fantastic people with very unique histories, and tell the story of how mining got to where it is now.
Yeah, I agree with you, Priscilla. And there are a couple of elements about the interesting way of Glenn and Luke joining us and the enthusiasm that they have put in this is that they have lived the stories. They have been there in the trenches. They have seen the transformation, and they have seen also, sadly, the consequences when things were not run right. So navigating history with them had been fascinating, factual, very respectful to all stakeholders involved, but at the same time very informative of how we move forward, and it's great. Also, we have been inspired by scholars. We have been inspired by Kate Raworth with the donut economics. We have been inspired by Edward Friedman when we talk about stakeholder engagement. We have been inspired by Michael Porter around share value and the competitive advantage of nations. And we have been inspired by scholars in many, many, many years of his building history around the distribution of wealth and resources, which is kind of the core of the challenges of the industry when it just become fundamental for the GDP of countries and so on, and the well-being of peoples. So there's so many elements that we can say come to the dining table, and Luke and Glenn in even in the early stories, and that's one of the things that as children they grew up in similar living and observing similar situations that will make very interesting the analysis for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, it was fantastic. And I think with your background, Monica, in working with communities, there's a tremendous wealth of insights that came out. I think this sense of mining really having been at the core of the colonization process that happened in the past, and then continuing on with the interactions with indigenous groups, with social organizations, and the concept of not just economic value associated with mining, but of the social value that is there, but unrecognized very often by mining operations, and changing the strategy in responsible mining towards creating not just economic value, but also social value and environmental value was a continuing conversation throughout. It was one of those crosscuts that really we need to take on as we move into our next podcast series and creating the dinner party that's focused on different aspects that were unearthed or mined out of this podcast series with Glenn and Luke. It was fantastic to be able to be a part of it.
And please, Priscilla, let's recognize your knowledge, experience, and talent too, because I think that the beauty of the experience is that we were able to, coming from a very different academic backgrounds and very different cultural backgrounds, you and I, we were able to bring that expertise that you carry for many years and very well recognized in terms of finding that it is a purpose in the engineering of all of this. And on my end, at the same time, it is efficiency to happen on the social side too. So it's where we were able to meet in the middle. And I think that the solution is precisely on that combining talent, knowledge, and experiences to create value and create solutions for the regions that we operate. And one thing that I love in one of your notes is when you say is that effectively redefining the end of the mineral's life cycle. And I would love that you expand on that, because because you are very close on the technical side to understand that, but at the same time, you have the sensitivity to understand that what is that mineral life cycle, certainly for people, the environment, the planet, at the same time for companies and operation, no? Because it is critical responsibility on their end.
I think that request for me to comment brings up two things most immediately. One is the concept of time, because when you establish a life cycle, you have to have a concept of time. And we realized very early on that the concept of time varied dramatically in the different players, the different stakeholders that were part of the mining enterprise. And that this lack of appreciation of time was one of the major causes of confrontations or lack of communication that was needed. Where mining is a fairly short-term prospect, decision making for what's going on now. Even ESG, environmental social governance issues, are really backward-looking, sort of what have you done to date? Whereas life cycle has to extend beyond where we are now into the future. And for mining, it stops when you're done with mining. And for the indigenous groups, it stops with never. It stops with forever. And the reestablishment of a new and ideally better environment in the future than there was in the past. So that represents a lack of communication, which I think we're starting to address, but it's very important that we realize that exists. But the second thing that comes up here, and you will know I will bring it up, is Kay Graber's concept of donut economics, with the basic sense of the finiteness of the Earth. We saw in 1969 the blue marble, the Earth, and had our first Earth Day. We started changing our attitudes towards the Earth and the finiteness of the resources, the responsibility that we had as a society for the continuation of life on Earth and the improvement of it continually. So this sense of donut economics and living in the dough, the realization that there are planetary systems that constitute boundaries that we should not transcend. And there's also the global concept of social rights, as exemplified by the SDG from the United Nations. All of this came together and was churning, so that in the 1960s, I think mining, which hadn't really thought of itself as being good or bad, came to the conclusion that why don't people like us? And with an amazement that they didn't understand why people did not trust and like mining. So this podcast series here gets to the core of why mining has gotten to where it is now, in so many lessons that were experienced, but so many new people in mining that don't know those lessons, that haven't experienced them, that we owe it to everyone to sort of lay it out and say, how did we get to where we are now? And then to look forward to where the future might be different, where we can remember those lessons and not repeat them in the future.
Yeah, you just brought extraordinary points, and we will hear in the conversation with Glenn and Luke and much more further. When we have to be realistic that mining has been the center and associated with the colonization process, in a form of colonization process, in the relation with governments, and therefore the relation with local communities and indigenous peoples. And the concept of access to land and the violation of rights had been part of that disgust and the disapproval of mining on that as a colonization. had impacted the development of many regions. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, Priscilla, because when you say we're going to do the analysis at the core, is precisely one of the elements that the industry has a duty to do better every single time. And we are an industry that can do extraordinary things because we are the only industry who invests in regions that are forgotten or countries that probably no many investors will go, and communities could find an opportunity for improving the living conditions, having access to building capacity, having access to education and stability. And that is the good that we can bring if mining is aligned to that respect to the environment and communities and social, and understanding that the governance is not only a mandate for compliance, it is a spine to keep the industry running with values and ethics that are needed when we operate in remote areas. And that is actually one of the things that we find fascinating. All of this doesn't go against technology. All of this doesn't go against the progress because we see an industry moving forward. And I hope that as we expand the conversations, we are going to bring that to the table, that we are an industry that needs progress on the technology side. And is not against principles of respect or responsibility.
Yeah. Um, yes, I think that one thing that I've learned that's very difficult for me because I'm a verbal person. I think with my mouth open, as I've always said.
That's the best part of you.
So I like to talk because new ideas evolve. But in listening to Glenn and Luke and listening to their stories about developing mentoring, developing communications opportunities, it's so involved in listening. And I have recently had occasion to try this where you have someone talking to you, telling you what they think the issues are, and I immediately want to respond. But I made myself not respond, but instead say, here's what I heard you say. Is this what you were talking about? And instead, I had to listen to what they were saying instead of hearing my voice in my head. And I think that's an essence of so many of the programs that Luke and Glenn have been involved in, where they've had to find a way for people to listen to each other and to understand what the values are, what the perspectives are that are coming together. And they're great communicators, so they made it possible for me, somebody as lug-headed as me, to understand that maybe the way I operated was not the way I had to operate. And maybe I could change it. And that's the perspective of the mining companies as well, I think, that we need in the future. And people talk about collaboration and they talk about stewardship as being key words for the mining industry in the future. The basic perspectives of collaboration, where it's not the mining company doing the design and making the decision. It is a consultative, collaborative process that needs to be developed that has in the past not often been appreciated by mining companies. And the basic sense of who owns the material, who owns the ore, becomes very important, because if you're the one who owns the ore, all you want is, in your mining company, you want to mine the ore. That's what you want. But if you're thinking you're part of a social group, indigenous or otherwise, and you think that you own the material and are responsible to be a steward of the way it's used and the way it's mined, we immediately have a clash. So that sense of adopting a collaborative process, but also recognizing that stewardship is almost in the eyes of the beholder, and the sense of what that means in the context of any mining operation that's proposed or ongoing has to be discussed and renewed throughout the life of mine.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that is the world is in general. Mining and many other industries are living that transformation from the government makes the decision, and I deal with the government, and I get permits from the government, and I make friends with the government, and a lot of things happen on that, and was I mean, just basically ended up creating corruption and all sort of backdoor deals. Now we are moving in the transparent new way of doing business, and that calls for that engagement piece. And that engagement piece only happens when you recognize who your stakeholders are. And the most difficult part is what you just say, listening. And you were making a beautiful comment when you say, very much like the industry, I didn't listen. And I think that one lesson learned here is that one thing is designing with the top engineering mind, and working on all potential risks associated with the engineering and technical component. But for many years, we ignored that you can have extraordinary design in your computer and in your blueprints, but it's not going to happen if you don't have the social approval. So it stays in your computer forever. And
Right.
that bridge is precisely what you just say: collaboration, listening, and understanding that a stakeholder's perspective come into account. Indigenous peoples, the perception of time and the association with land needs to be considered, because agreements happen around that. I have the great fortune of working on those agreements, and they want, and it's interesting because sadly, so many groups think that indigenous people want to live as they are today, and it's not true. I have been in the trenches. I have been with them. I have been in at the core of the Amazonian jungle, and the extreme poverty that they live. They don't want to live like that. They want progress under the label of respect and responsibility. And when the industry understands that and work along that collaboration that you just mentioned as a core principle, that's when we can move extraordinary projects out of blueprints and computers to the real life and becoming opportunities for many. And you mentioned something also, that who owns the ore, and that is when the state plays a role here to to manage the resources in a way that can reach and address the needs of people who will be impacted by projects. But that's a huge step. Number one, acknowledging that I have to listen. Number two, I need to identify who are my stakeholders. And number three, be open to work and collaborate with them. Is a huge mindset that needs to change, and it's happening. I think the beauty of this is that we are moving towards that transition, and that inspires me when we start a few years ago about the podcast, is that this is bringing the logic of why transformation has to happen, and bringing like Glenn and Luke and you and so many extraordinary people out there to see how we can do better in this transformation process that we are living, and how it's still part of a business case, because we need those projects to be successful in order to multiply the benefits that they can carry. So I think that is one of the elements that we're going to hear a lot in the conversations between Glenn and Luke.
And from in this conversation, we did address some of the issues associated with the legacy of mining,
Exactly.
and the basic sense that we have created a lot of of waste materials, of abandoned sites where responsible mining was not conducted, and yet we don't really have the will and the resources to do something about it. Very often, we're guided by threats of liability or concerns on that right. But this is not something that should be related to liability. This is something that actually needs to get managed, whether you're talking about environmental problems associated with legacy mine waste sites or water impacts, or whether you're talking about the tremendous volume of mine tailings that have been stored on the surface of the earth and represent a continuing risk. Every year, we have multiple failures of these old tailings locations. And and we're not really making steps towards addressing the problem. I think from an engineering perspective, every time there is a failure of a tailings storage facility, people are by and large surprised. Nobody was saying that dam is going to fail, but suddenly it does. So engineers have a challenge right now to face the problem that we need solutions that have not yet been executed, if known, or that have not been identified as yet because we haven't done the research. We haven't done our homework on how to do this. So although that's not a focus throughout this podcast series, it's one for the future of really discussing that issue of how do we translate responsibility from current mining operations where the focus has been, or future mining operations backwards in time, into responsible management of what we have done over the past 10,000 years of mining that has not been cared for.
And I think that this going back, and I'm glad that you mentioned, and at the same time manage expectations about this. There are so many issues here, but we're going to be tackling a little bit about the influence that the financial industry have. And not right now we see it with GISTM and precisely what you were talking about, tailing failure. And we see that the global standard goes heavy on the social side around the people impacted. And not this podcast will discuss that, but at the core principle of the discussion between Glenn and Luke is going back to that root, is that awareness of the responsibility that we have when we operate in vulnerable regions. And regions vulnerable because environment, biodiversity, indigenous peoples, the communities, and governments that are not strong enough. So, but it's critically important, this first part, because it takes us about to the core of who are we responsible? What are we responsible for? And later, most probably, we're going to be evolving on topics that are at the core of the industry, as you mentioned, and nobody better than you. You are the world-recognized expert in tailings, and tailings is very much, from the engineering side, a huge project, and from the social side, a huge impact.
And it's global. And I think that back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we were thinking in the United States, inward looking. Canada has been a bit more global, international, but now we can't solve this problem just in the United States. It's very difficult to get any mine permitted in the United States these days. And we sort of look towards a future where we're the importers and the consumers. And in many ways, Canada is going in the same direction. Europe is going in the same direction. So this sense of a stewardship of the earth means that there's a responsibility of a consuming organization for recycling. And we're starting to see some of the mining companies do this, where they're diversifying downstream and thinking about the downstream circular economy and the responsibility that maps onto that circular economy. Some mining companies doing some like battery recycling, taking on the tasks beyond mining itself, which I think is a wonderful sign. But governments have to be thinking the same way globally. So when the United States says it wants to beef up in domestic production of critical minerals, realistically, that's not likely to happen in the time frame that's being proposed right now. So instead of really inward looking, and we should look inward and do what we can internally, we also have to think globally and think about the entire global supply chain, which involves, in many cases, artisanal mining, small-scale mining, and bringing the small-scale mining operations and artisanal mining to the point where they're having it's really a viable and productive way of life, and not just look to big mining companies to take care of it. I think in terms of the government governance part of this, there has to be I think an understanding and a response to the needs of artisanal mining and small scale mining, where hundreds of thousands of people are involved in that, and they're just hidden from all of these discussions. But I know you know so much about that, Monica, that you can weigh in and really provide insights on what we can do, what we should be aware of.
Well, I think it's a whole community that can bring insights. It's not only Monica, but we are part of the huge supply chain. And this is the first time that the industry is getting so close to consumers, because the only part that we were just kind of seeing closer was diamonds that we put in our fingers or whereas as jewelry. But now we are part of enormous supply chain, and we see that closer. We have been always been part of the pharmaceutical industry, of infrastructure industry, automotive industry, because we are the raw materials. And having that clear understanding in terms of supply chain, it is a very interesting opportunity for the industry to work responsibly. And on the other hand, it's like the growing population is going to be a growing demand for minerals, and new innovative ideas like urban mining, and new ideas about how we can integrate artisanal mining and small scale mining, as you mentioned, will become part of the responsibility that we have if we want to have a healthy supply chain. But let's move a little bit more on what we talk about, the lessons learned from Glenn and Luke around what is sustainable frameworks. They were also talking about how they gather in many events during the last 20 years and slowly shaping frameworks that help the industry to move on that. And that is very interesting how we're going to hear from Glenn and Luke, by the way, one lawyer in there, that talking about how they evolved from Lima and in discussions around this. I don't know if you would like to share a little bit about of that, because it's very interesting to see that we have evolved already. It's in the making.
Yeah, very much so. I really appreciated some of the comments and insights about what happens during mergers, because if a company may be acting extremely responsibly and set up wonderful relationships, which is really what's going on when trust is established. You build a relationship that's long term, and then you come in the next day and that person's gone because there's been a takeover. And now there's someone else saying, okay, let's start over again. And no, the stakeholders don't want to start over again. They established trust. And all too often, that trust establishment is based on informal relationships. So as we learn from them, that idea of formalizing these both the relationships and that basis for trust is all too often not done. And we need to pay attention to the formalism so that when a merger happens, when there's a buyout, new management comes in, there's a basis for continued understanding. And that seems very straightforward, but obviously it's not always accomplished.
Yeah, well, and it's precisely what you just say, is that informality. We have been informally operating and much more around environmental, social, and governance. All ESGs have been very informal for the last 40 years or more. Now is that companies start kind of facing that they need to collect data, and they have to structure stakeholder engagement plans and in social investment plans, and very, very structured, as you just say, because was a informal, casual relationship with communities and stakeholders. And the frameworks help to bring that discipline and ensure that things are done in a structured way, and somebody else can come and continue the good work that has been done. So it is a lot that we cover in here to go back to why we are here today and what we learn from history. For me, it has been a fascinating opportunity to learn and hear from the voices that have been there in the trenches and all this, and see the conversation happening in the dining party, going back to that original idea that we had and the extraordinary chats and conversations we were exploring ideas on how integrate make a big community thinking about this and make it better for us and for the world and for everybody.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. And I think we touched on a couple of topics in the podcast that really required to be expanded in the future. And what occurs to me was the issue of the volatility of the mining brain set related to commodity prices. There is truly a value associated with the metals, and it's not defined by the commodity price index. We have to get away from that volatility so that we have a better understanding of what the real value is. I think we touched a little bit on workforce issues, that just simply finding the talent that is going to lead the mining industry into the future, when the number of people involved in mining and mining related fields at university studies or in graduate school or on continuing professional development is not where it needs to be. So we have to figure out a way to address the workforce needs globally, not just in our countries, but it's a global issue. And I think if you go to most United States schools, you'll find a majority of the graduate students in mining are not U.S. domestic students. They're people from all around the world coming in. And I guess one thing in addition that I would like to explore in the future, which we talked with Lauren about with the Sustainable Development Solutions with the angle from the United Nations, was what can we learn from other sectors in terms of how they have evolved. And talked a bit about agriculture and the way agriculture and mining are both fundamental industries, which both have artisanal, small-scale components and large-scale components. But the public's attitude towards agriculture is quite different from the public's attitude towards mining in terms of environmental and social impacts, in terms of intrinsic goodness. And so exploring what other sectors have done or what their branding is, and may inform an effective way to rebrand or re-explain mining to the public in a different way. So it's not extractive, which is a very strong word when people say it's an extractive industry. Well, no, maybe it's a stewardship industry. Take what you need, leave the rest, don't mess up anything around the area. Responsible behavior. So I'd like to get rid of the word extractive. I'd like to get rid of the word waste, because all of the mine waste is just simply unused resource. So let's not consider it to be waste. Let's redefine it. And I think if we just think about some of those fundamental redefinitions, it may change the attitudes both of mining towards itself and of the people who are watching mining, the impacted groups and individuals. It's a very exciting time in the future, Mónica.
It is certainly. And I think that you just beautifully put together so many discussions that could continue happening in our dinner party. And I love the fact of connecting with agriculture, because for many years I have been very serious thinking on the two industries that keep us alive as animal in this planet and part of the ecosystem are both mining and agriculture. And both industries have so much similarities and can do so much good or can do so much bad. But let's keep the table set and open for more conversations. And for now, I think that let's enjoy how much Glenn and Luke share with us and looking and learning from the past.
That's wonderful closure. Thank you so much, Mónica. It's always a delight to work with you.
It is much more a delight working with you, Priscilla, and let's invite everybody to join our dinner party and be part of the conversation.